What we need is evangelicals and Catholics who discern the primary demand of our time, the celebration of our heavenly participation in the eternal Word of God. Only a heavenly-minded Christian faith will do us any earthly good. Hans Horsma.
This is the Redeemed Imagination Podcast, a podcast of the Anselm Society on re-enchanting the church. Hello and welcome back to the Redeemed Imagination Podcast. I'm Brian Brown with Father Matt Burnett, Monsignor Smith, Heidi White, and Joel Clarkson. We are continuing our conversation that we left off last time. We've been talking about what is imagination, why does it matter, how everyone has one and everyone uses it all the time. It's not a matter of fantasy over here and reason over here. It's a matter of how and where and in what way you derive meaning and how you encounter the world in a meaningful way. And you can do that better or you can do it worse. And you can form that well, or it can be underformed or malformed. And one of the things that we were knocking up against quite regularly as we neared the end of that conversation was the obvious follow-up question in our particular context, which is, what is then a Christian imagination? What is a redeemed imagination? Is there something categorically different about a Christian imagination? Or is it a difference of degrees? What is it that we're talking about here? On another level, what does it mean to look upon the world Christianly? What does it look like? The Anselm Society, our mission, is a renaissance of the Christian imagination. All right, well, that's a big, bold goal. Hypothetically, what if we achieved that? What would it look like? What would Christians look like? What would churches look like? What would the church, capital C, look like? I think one of the big challenges that we face in that context, the challenge that we faced last time was, what if we have a malformed or underformed imagination? Or what if we've been taught that it's a bad thing or that we don't have one? I think the challenge this time is more the fact that, I would posit all of us have had imaginations that are more formed by secular or anti-Christian or unhealthy things than by healthy things. And that's not a sort of a Christian purity culture statement where we're inherently good and we must protect ourselves from all of these external bad things, and that's how the dynamic of the world works. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am suggesting that anything that we do to follow the instructions of the Bible and let our mind dwell on the good, the true, and the beautiful, more often than not, comes at the expense of feeding the kids, sitting in traffic, practical needs, but also just the liturgies of our daily life, the habits, the rhythms that mark our daily life. There's a reason that the early church and the church for hundreds and hundreds of years marked its life by frequent structured prayer, because you have to be intentional in involving God, and you have to be intentional about approaching life in a way that is God-centered, because otherwise life runs away with you. And it does with all of us at different points, and it does with many of us most of the time. If I look at the way that I spent yesterday, the amount of time that was spent checking Facebook, being angry at a driver in front of me, thinking about the pursuit of material wealth so that I can feed my family, this mixture of practical and or worldly concerns, that was probably, on a good day, 70, 80% of my day, 70, 80% of my minutes. And I'd be kidding myself to suggest that that didn't have an impact. And in that sense, for me to have a Christian imagination is in some sense, I think, to push back against that percentage. What does it mean to push back against that dynamic in such a way that, or for my children, what would it look like for them to grow up in such a way that they were so filled, so stoked, so surrounded by the best stories and deriving meaning in the right things? And do they care more about being compassionate or more about being successful? All of these things, if they're raised that way, if that's Christian imagination, well, my goodness, what does that look like, and how do we get there? This is the small, manageable, simple topic that we have set ourselves for discussion today. let me start with, this is the obvious question at some level for this particular group, because we have touched on it before in our guest appearance on the Belief to See podcast. What is a Christian imagination? And specifically, is a Christian imagination a thing that you either have or don't have? Or is it a difference in degree of a larger thing?
I'm going to jump in on that and say that I think that it is different, that it is in fact something that we enter into. If you are born in sin and you're dead in sin until you are reborn in Christ, there isn't a way to have a Christian imagination. Because if you define Christian imagination as entering into the mind of Christ, that's how I would define it. It's not possible to do that apart from entering into Christ and having him enter you. So from the standpoint of what is a Christian imagination, I think that when we talk about what it means to have a redeemed imagination, I'm hoping that what it means is that my imagination becomes increasingly transformed to be like Jesus's, like Christ's own imagination, the word that spoke the world into existence, the mind that created that capacity to incarnate out of nothing. What I'm hoping that happens in the way that I see things imaginatively is that I see a world that is infused with a permanent sense of inevitable hope and victory, but also deeply rooted in the reality that there's darkness, and it's terribly, terribly dark. That there's a light that overcomes that. I don't want to be living in an imagined idea that everything will be rosy and that the outcomes will be simple. But I do need to be rooted in the belief that victory is how it will end. And there's a day coming when there will be a day and there will be no more night. The way of looking at that as a redeemed imagination, a redeemed worldview, changes how I see everything else. Everything bends to that. And so when we talk about having a Christian imagination, it isn't we're not talking about a church defined, theologically defined imagination. We're talking about something that's infused with the mind of God. And how does he see what can be and what is?
Brief interruption. That was Lancia Smith, who is the focus of our personal spotlight this time. We're not going to do this every time, but since we're just starting out with a new podcast, we are going to allow one of us per episode for the first 5 episodes or so to occupy a little bit more front and center. And I've encouraged the featured guest to be extra liberal in their sharing of personal stories and favorite books and that sort of thing. But yeah, picking up from where you left off and where I so rudely interrupted. Okay, so you're suggesting it's its own thing. Does anyone feel differently or want to nuance that?
I do want to nuance it. I don't want to disagree with it. Because this is something I'm not sure of. So here is my speculation or question mark. I'm going to go way back to the classics, to Plato. And he talks about this concept of recognition, right? When we encounter something we've never heard before, but we recognize it as true, right? And that sense of transformation and transcendence that comes from that. I'm sure everybody around this table knows what that is, and our listeners do too. You read something, you hear something, you talk to somebody, have a conversation, and you're like, that's what I've been looking for. Right? What, you too? I thought I was the only one. Or, I have felt that my whole life, but I could never put it into words. And I maybe still can't, but I recognize it. Mm-hmm. So that experience of recognition comes from something deeply embedded within us that is the image of God. Mm-hmm. Right? So in a sense, I think we all have a Christian imagination that's just waiting for that experience of recognition to connect it to the physical world and our own experiences. Because non-Christians have that too. Plato had that. he was pre-Christian. So I guess I may be arguing that we all have a Christian imagination that's waiting to be uncovered.
Maybe we might want to rephrase it from a Christian imagination to something that where we all, because I do think this is true. Universally, I think all people have the capacity to recognize the face of God.
And it doesn't always lead to conversion, but it's still a transcendent experience.
I mean, is there a correlation to natural versus special revelation here?
Sure. Maybe.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
And I also don't think, though, that necessarily involves the name of Christian imagination. But I think it's important to be distinctive about that, because Christian means to follow Christ. But I think that all human beings can recognize, and do in fact recognize, the face of God, because it's all of us. We're
made
formed
for
that. So there's something in us that will in fact recognize the good, the true, and the beautiful. Like we know it from afar. Something does distinctively happen, though, I believe, when we enter into, when we're reborn. Maybe not, but
I think that, I wonder if, in a sense, no, I think you're right, Lancia. I think in one sense, the Christian imagination, I still would, I like that term, or I do too. And I find it to be very much sort of in tune with the idea that Christianity, again, we've talked about this a little bit in the last podcast, but that it's an encounter with a person. You're right, I think, Lancia, to focus so fully on Christ, because at the core of Christianity is not simply a religious doctrinal statement or a knowing in an intellective sense. It is coming into encounter with Christ, a person who is the image of God made visible to us in our time and space in history. And when you were talking about sort of having imagination as being able to enter into the darkness of the world and the hope that comes out of that, and the hope that is beyond that, the way that we as Christians enter into that is to contemplate Christ, to let him become, just like he came into our world. The redemptive narrative of Christ's incarnation is that Christ comes into our lives, and that the more we contemplate him, the closer we come to him, that he has drawn near to us, and that we become sort of, I think the Christian imagination is one which is oriented to the life of Christ, and it takes on that narrative. And I think that when that happens, it tends to illuminate our past experiences in such a way that we say, that's what I was encountering. I didn't realize it, but that's what I was seeing. And so
Christ, even when they didn't have the language for it, that the shape of that story was already in so much of the pagan thinking. It's one of the reasons I love pagan mythology, for the same thing, because God was speaking the language that would later prepare us to receive it.
Let me ask a question then. What's the difference? And I'm setting this up because I think there's a difference. I'll just say it up front. What's the difference between,
it's a trick question.
It's slightly rhetorical, but what's the difference between recognizing the echoes of the story, the great story, and being in love with and knowing the storyteller? I don't think they're equivalent. I don't think they're the same. Well, fair enough, Joel, but go to the differences.
Well,
I don't think
I know
they can
instantly people hear that as,
other,
especially from a hard evangelical background, they hear it as, oh, you can't talk about Jesus and you have to shoehorn Jesus in every conversation. I'm not saying that, but I am, again, and I want to be careful about like pulling the Bible card. Got to be careful there. But I think there's a biblical picture of recognizing the echoes of the Creator and knowing and loving the Creator, especially the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That biblical picture of that. I think there's a difference.
I think one is the precursor potentially to the other, but like you can recognize something from afar, but when you enter into love, you've made a choice. And I don't think that choice is always, I'll be honest, I don't think it's always a rational choice. when I fell in love with the Lord, well, for one thing, I was too little to be rational when that actually happened. I recognized him, but I loved him from the everything I ever heard about him from the beginning. But I've known other people who recognized that and really, really did recognize it and do recognize it, but they stand back. I've seen people stand back, even seeing all of it, and they don't want to enter into the commitment that it means to love someone. And I see it in people who, I'll just be honest, there are a lot of people that I see who love cooking, but do not necessarily see the presence of Christ in that and don't enter into any kind of a relationship connected to Christ in it. They recognize the pagan stories and the goodness, but they don't want to bow to the author of it.
It's used maybe biblical language of adoption. It's like, I see a family that I respect, love, and think the world of, but I don't want to be adopted by them.
Oh, yeah. Or another one is that I don't mind seeing who you are, but I don't want to marry you. Because I do think that there is that. But at least what I would hope that would come out of this, out of the discussion, is that when we say, what is a Christian imagination? I would like to reach a point where where I don't feel like I don't have to be ashamed to say, I have a Christian imagination. I see through a Christian worldview. And I'm not trying to say that other worldviews are not valuable. They are. But
great point.
But a Christian imagination is something distinct.
But two questions. Then do you have to be a Christian to have a Christian imagination? And then the flip side of that, do all Christians then have a Christian imagination?
Yes and no, respectively.
So this is actually a really complicated question.
Yes and yes.
It's a really
very complicated.
Thank you, because it is. You're right.
Is a
You're
Christian,
totally right.
And I would argue that a Christian imagination is different from a Christian worldview. And so if we're talking about a worldview, I heartily agree with what both of you are saying. If we're talking about a Christian imagination, I think Plato and Homer had Christian imaginations. They were not Christians.
Okay, so now we have to do some defining of terms.
Right.
What do you mean? What do you mean when you say worldview?
Go ahead, Joel. You've been waiting. Yep.
That's great.
Can I? Well, I think I want to sort of answer that in a long sense.
I agree.
I would actually maybe suggest that Christian imagination is a cultivated posture. And what I mean by that is that Lewis, but I may differ slightly only in saying that I don't think it's a posture that can be cultivated fully outside of a fully Christian framework. I think I want to think through what Lewis talks about, going back to that sense of myth and the way that Balder, what he talks about in Longfellow, Balder, the beautiful is dead. He, at a very young age, he has this just sense of longing for that to be true. And he's using, Lewis is very carefully and thoughtfully using the romantic notion of Sehnsucht, or the inconsolable longing. And in a romantic sense, of course, Sehnsucht is truly inconsolable. It's the longing we all have that can never truly be answered. But Lewis helps to cultivate in us an understanding of Sehnsucht in a redeemed way, by suggesting that if we have a longing for something which we can't grasp, perhaps it means that there's another place which we are destined for. There's something beyond. And so in a sense, what he's doing is he's saying there is this longing that everyone has. And it's what draws us, our imaginations. It captivates our imaginations and puts them into work. But I think that in a Christian sense, the Christian imagination is what crafts a posture of saying we have an inconsolable longing, because it's not just inconsolable, and that's the end of the sentence. We have an inconsolable longing that moves us towards something.
Brilliant.
And I think that the Christian imagination is what gives us the posture to look in the direction
I might put
of
this
hope.
in a practical example.
So I think I would say that in that sense, it's a cultivated posture.
Speaking with some of the Anselm Society's artist leaders last night, and we talked about this question, but it was in a very practical context. we were talking about what it means to be a Christian artist. And now we're talking about imagination. We're talking about more than art here, but this is one example that I think is instructive. We talked about how, on the most basic level, a real step of liberation for a lot of artists is the realization that they don't have to create for money, for fame, for this external pressure. And then it's a real step of liberation to realize I can create by having this sort of experience. I can create by having this experience of sort of authenticity, of this is who I am, and I'm going to create on some level for me. I'm going to create because this is who God made me to be, and he made me for this purpose, and I'm going to live into that. Now, you can get to that point without being a Christian. You can have that same realization.
Yes.
Maybe you use the word God, maybe you don't, right? But you can get there without being a Christian. That's a step towards a Christian approach to being an artist, but it's not a uniquely Christian approach. And there are many Christian artists for whom that's sort of step one, and it's a big step as an artist of faith. But there's something beyond that, because if you're creating only for yourself, one could make the argument you're not fully doing art, because art is transactional in the sense of it assumes a relationship, it assumes an audience. Mm-hmm. And it is another step from there to create for someone else, not simply an abstract someone else, not an audience in the hypothetical, but a person, your church, your community. These people need what I have, and I'm going to give it to them. Or at the highest level, God has called me to do this for these people at this time. That is a step you don't make in the absence of a more fully formed Christian imagination. Is that a useful example? I'm trying to bring this back from the purely hypothetical to something that's a little more hands-on.
No, I think that is really helpful, because I think that that's a huge part of what makes it complete, is that ultimately everything that Christ is talking about is always relational. Right. I mean, God is love. I mean, if you just go to that, it implies that if you love, the love is going somewhere and is waiting for something to potentially come back. So, if we look at the incarnation of what our imaginations might be, the intention is to share that with someone in love for the purpose of doing some good for them, and that there may be something that comes back. So it's always relational. And if it's not, then it is completely, we can solve a lot of things by writing in our journals just for ourselves. It's a really important practice, as artists, as journal, writers, where I don't expect somebody to read that. I write with the intention that nobody ever will. But I don't think that's art. I don't think that's literature. That's a practice. When I am writing a blog, or I am doing an interview, I am absolutely thinking about my readers. And I'm thinking of specific faces, people that have said, I'm struggling with this. So that's an answer going out. So part of the Christian imagination is the context in which that we do this, not for self-expression, but for the sake of another.
And in that sense, the Christian imagination, I think, is a huge answer to a major cultural problem that we have right now. You have, coming out of the world wars in the 20th century, you have this dynamic where, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into in this conversation, the artist starts to perceive himself as outside of society. The sort of the stereotype of the lonely, starving artist who's just misunderstood by everybody, or very bitter against society. That's a very much a historical aberration. The notion that art was created to sort of fling at somebody is very unusual historically. And I think potentially what you just described, Lancia, is part of the answer that the Christian imagination offers to the world now, in a sense that even a pretty healthily developed non-Christian imagination might not. to create out of love for the sake of another. And especially as you start to look at others in the sense of specific communities who are just, they live near miles and miles of homes and strip malls, just like everybody else. And their lives are marked by the same rhythms and habits as everyone else. And they're desperately in need of somebody to say, not just for propositionally, there is more than this, but to show it to them and offer it to them and say, here's something you can make a part of your day, your month, your year, your existence that is more than that trip to the grocery store.
And I would even say in some ways that notion that you just talked about with artists starts earlier. It starts in Romanticism, or early Romanticism especially. You start to see it with the emergence of sort of the use of a religious framework, but the sort of emptying of that framework of the, well, to put it in very, just absolute terms, the flesh of Christianity, which is the actual person at the center of it, Christ, and the implications that the Christian story has. So resurrection is a really fascinating theme, and so is death, but not a bodily resurrection. And death becomes not something that reveals the sacrifice that love goes through to achieve the good of another. It simply becomes worshipped in of itself. All of these aspects are distanced from the embodiment of the person at the center of the story, Christ. And I think that's why you have this idea of Sehnsucht that arises, the inconsolable longing. And in a sense, I think I wouldn't put them together directly. There's many reasons why we live in such a highly consumeristic culture, but we have such a strong sense. The reason perhaps you could say that we have this intensity of focusing on our social platforms while we ignore our neighbors is because we're longing for self-fulfillment, because we are this romantic self re-embodied over and over again without the actual sort of center point, without the rooting point of Christ, who is the person who came into our midst and became one of us.
Right. I think that's
without that sense,
really
how do we know
important
how to be in community? How do we know how to participate in communion?
Have you all read The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene? Okay. So there's this wonderful scene in that book. It's a wonderful novel. Everybody should read this novel.
Yeah.
And Graham Greene said this was the favorite and his best scene he ever wrote. And it's the priest he's on the run from the communists in Mexico, and he is arrested for carrying liquor. They don't know he's the priest. So they put him in jail because liquor is illegal. Turns out he was trying to buy communion wine to perform illegal masses, but he was caught with the bottle of brandy. Also, he's an alcoholic, which is a huge part of the tension of this novel. He has also fathered a child. So he's in mortal sin. He's the last priest in Mexico being hunted down, and there's nowhere for him to confess. So he knows if he is caught and killed, his soul will be damned according to the Catholic theology that he believes in. So he spends the night in jail with all of these other people, and he can't see them. And they all find out he's the priest. And there's one lone faithful Catholic woman there who's been arrested because she has pictures of saints. And she is so glad, just so happy to be with this priest. And she starts telling him all about her life and how good she is. And he tells her, I'm a bad priest. I'm a bad man. I deserve to die. I'm in mortal sin. And she keeps telling him how good he is until he confesses his sins to her. And then she condemns him. You are a bad priest. You do deserve to die. And there's this beautiful line when he's speculating to himself about this woman, and he's praying for her, even though she's condemning him. And he says, hate is just a failure of imagination. Because what this woman cannot do, even though she has a Christian worldview, is imagine herself like him, condemned and on the run and afraid and lost and in mortal sin with no hope, still clinging to his vocation as a priest. And that capacity of the soul and the mind to engage in the sufferings of others, that's the Christian imagination. And I do think that has to be had now by Christians. You can't reject God and have a Christian imagination. But I think there is a difference between viewing the world as a Christian and imagining the world as a Christian.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a great description of that.
Lancia, are there aspects of this that you've seen in
actively
Cultivating Project, the writers that you've worked with, the feedback you've gotten from audience? Can you, talk a little bit about cultivating and what the vision is there? And second, if things come to mind in that context, to pick up on where Heidi left off.
I think one of the essential things that I look for and that I hope to see happen with cultivating, especially in terms of the Cultivating Project, where we're working directly with individual writers or individual artists, is really the intention of helping people to integrate their gifts with their calling and with what we're called to commonly as humans and as Christians, which has to do with spiritual formation, spiritual maturity. When I'm looking at that, I'm always hoping that what we're doing is helping people to develop something that's less of an idea and more of a way of being. I'm really not even talking about a way of life. So what we've lost, and when I think of Christian imagination, I'm thinking of something that is so deeply integrated that the virtues of what it means to be a believing Christian, a dependent on God believing Christian, is so deeply rooted in somebody that what comes out of that is a way of not only creating art, but of living and of seeing other human beings in a way that is always redemptive, always full of possibility, which is not to say that there are not going to be times when somebody chooses to reject the possibility of redemption. I've met people that have chosen that, and I'm sure that everybody, all of our listeners, I'm sure have also met people who have chosen to reject the possibility of redemption. But the idea behind the Cultivating Project was, in fact, to help grow believing writers in particular, but also musicians and artists, designers, jewelry makers, to see the power of what it means to create in context of redemption. And the way that I see the critical part of that, is that every time somebody is a little bit more fused with all the parts of themselves that God made, it does in fact bring a little bit more of the really real into the world.
Yeah.
This is the work of incarnation at its most fundamental to me. It's not very glorious. A lot of the work that I do isn't necessarily very glamorous. It's long conversations and it's prayer and it's helping people practice the things that are in them. But that's the creative work of helping form a human being into themselves. The goal of cultivating is to help people find their courage and to help them remember, because memory is everything.
Memory is everything.
It's everything. If we cannot remember where we came from, the garden, if we cannot remember that we came from God before the planet was made, if we don't remember where we are going, we cannot remember what it means to live whole here in between, because we are in between. And yet, some way that I don't understand in the mystery of all of it, the presence of the kingdom of God is also here right now. And so part of it is about all the work of imagination is about helping to move the veil, some way with the Holy Spirit to move the veil so that we see that we are living in this partly right now, that the goodness of the kingdom is at hand. It's like right in our fingertips. Jesus is here with us right now. The Holy Spirit is here with us right now. The Father is with us right now. It's not like we're going to see, we will see with our eyes later when we really are physically present with the Lord, but there's a way of apprehending and seizing that is so critical right now. And so the work of cultivating is about how do we choose over and over the kinds of choices. And I love the way that Joel said this about cultivating a posture.
I love that too.
Because this is so much about making the same series of good choices again and again and again and again. And it's a lot like recovery. I'm a recovered addict, and a lot of what I have learned about what it means to live a whole life is through practicing 12 steps. Very, very basic. And to see that same model exercised by Christians allows Christians to become whole in ways that we're also fragmented. So that's my hope out of all of that, and why I think that this is so incredibly important. But all of that becomes possible through a wholesome use of a redeemed imagination.
There's so many. Go ahead, Joel, sorry.
I loved hearing you say that. Oh no, it's okay. I loved hearing that, the way you described that, Lancia. And as you mentioned posture, I was thinking about, incarnation is embodied. And I had this image thinking about cultivating, of being on the ground and getting our dirt under our fingernails and digging in the soil, and just how earthy that is. And that the Christian imagination is not a disembodied project.
Making
it's
something out of the beauty of God.
It's not intellective. It is getting on our hands and knees and starting to dig in the dirt and doing it together,
Yeah.
No, because that's what you do in the garden.
And that posture of being...
You get rid of the weeds unless you actually are.
And the posture of being on our hands and knees is actually not a bad one.
Because I can't get on my hands and knees. This is what happens to old people. But, there is something, though, about learning to make peace with the word cultivate and to choose that. Because it's about selection, but it's also about commitment. People can curate. And I've looked at this a lot. I see a lot of people who love the concept of curating. They want to be selective about what they surround themselves with, and they want to create good collections. And curating is really important because, there are a lot of things in the world that aren't worth drawing to yourself or saving necessarily. But cultivating is about making a choice to create conditions in which something can live and thrive. And it requires a long commitment. You don't cultivate seriously for a week because nothing will live and go through its life cycle in that time. Cultivating is about being willing to not only be selective, it's also about willing to nurture and to defend. And so it's always a posture of both nurturing and defending. It's a trowel and it's a sword. And every artist who thinks that is not the case is missing it. It's always about defending ourselves, defending the truth, defending our families, defending what's worth defending, as well as tending it and creating conditions in which something can actually grow. We have to do both. And we have to do it without thinking about it. I mean, you have to think about it, but you've got to be able to do it without resenting it too, because it isn't going to be just the tending. That's the part we all want, because that's the part that's kind. And defending is hard because you have to fight. And those two always seem like they're opposed, but I'm telling you, you have to. It's the world we live in.
This is the work.
That's right. This is the work.
And the conversation goes on. That's a big thing to leave with. But we are going to continue the conversation. There's all kinds of thorny follow-up questions we can jump into from there. And we will look forward to you joining us for future episodes. But in the meantime, I encourage you to get in touch with us, stay in touch, and know that we are not just having this conversation with each other. We're having this conversation for you. And if you will have us, we will have this conversation with you. You are not alone in pursuing this seemingly impossible goal. Until next time.
Amen.